The morning of October 17th, 1346, rose over the hills of northern England with a cold, pale light, the kind that foretold bloodshed long before any swords were drawn. On that day, two armies, one English, one Scottish, stood on the brink of a confrontation that would decide the fate of the North. What began as a political obligation, tangled in treaties and alliances stretching across the Channel, was now about to erupt into one of the most consequential battles of the Second War of Scottish Independence, the Battle of Neville's Cross. For years, England had been forced to divide its strength across multiple fronts. The struggle against Scotland had persisted since 1332, a relentless conflict punctuated by raids, ambushes, and uneasy truces that rarely held. At the same time, a far greater storm had begun to grow in the south, where the English king, Edward III, had escalated tensions with France into what would become the 100 Years' War. A truce agreed upon in January 1343 was supposed to quiet the fires of war between England, France, and Scotland until the autumn of 1346. But in reality, the agreement did little more than provide a thin veil over rising hostilities. Raids continued along the border, villages burned, and in October 1345, King David II of Scotland led a six-day incursion deep into English territory, signaling that the peace was little more than fiction. The alliance between France and Scotland formed the backbone of David's strategy. France, threatened by Edward III's preparations for a large invasion, sought desperately to divert English pressure. Philip VI of France urged David II to attack again, reminding him of the long-standing pact renewed in 1326, which bound the two kingdoms in mutual opposition to England. France needed relief, and Scotland was the lever that could force England to fight on two fronts. In July 1346, Edward III landed in Normandy with a massive force of 15,000 men. Philip VI, concerned that his kingdom lay exposed, once again pressed David II to strike. England's armies were scattered, not only in France, but also fighting in Brittany, Gascony, and Flanders. To the French king, the north of England seemed vulnerable, a land left unguarded while the English king risked everything across the Channel. This was the opportunity David II had been waiting for. But the Scots would quickly learn that England was not as undefended as the French king had promised. When Scottish forces probed the border, they encountered unexpectedly stiff resistance from local English defenders. These early clashes did not stop David II, but they did force him to negotiate a brief truce lasting until September 29th. In that time, Scotland mobilized its forces around Perth, gathering an army that, once assembled, would march south in a campaign meant to shatter English morale and stabilize France's collapsing military position. Meanwhile, the truce expired as the fortunes of France took a dire turn. English forces inflicted devastating defeats on the French, including the crushing victory at Crécy. Calais was now under English siege, and in the southwest, French defenses collapsed entirely with the fall of Poitiers. France needed Scotland more than ever, and David II finally answered that call. On October 7th, 1346, an army of about 12,000 Scots crossed into England. Many came armed with new weapons and armor supplied by France, and a number of French knights rode beside them, adding prestige and confidence to the campaign. The Scottish host swept southward, lighting the northern countryside with the flames of war. Their first major target was the border fort of Little Peel, which fell after a brutal three-day siege, its garrison massacred upon capture. Carlisle escaped destruction only by agreeing to pay a large indemnity, and the Scottish army pressed eastward, plundering every village and abbey in its path. They sacked Hexham Abbey and continued toward Durham, a city that now lay directly in their march of devastation. By October 16th, the Scots established their camp at Bear Park Priory near Durham. The monks, fearing the same fate as Hexham Abbey, offered a large amount of money for protection. From this position, the Scots prepared for what they believed would be an unopposed raid across northern England, unaware of the English forces gathering just beyond the horizon. Their invasion had been anticipated. As soon as news spread that the Scots had crossed the border, an English army was assembled at Richmond in North Yorkshire, under Archbishop William Zouche of York, who served as Lord Warden of the Marches. Though not large, only 3,000 to 4,000 men from Cumberland, Northumberland, and Lancashire, this force grew when 3,000 more men from Yorkshire joined them. Command of the combined 7,000 fell to Lord Ralph Neville, who immediately led them toward Durham, where the Scots camped, unaware of the danger closing in. The Scots only learned of the English approach on the morning of October 17th, when the enemy was a mere 6 miles away. What happened next would pull both kingdoms into an irreversible clash. Before dawn, as mist hung low over the fields near Merrington, a Scottish raiding party of 500 men under William Douglas stumbled directly into the advancing English army. The encounter was sudden and vicious. The rear divisions of the English host counterattacked swiftly, overwhelming the Scots in a brief yet deadly engagement that left around 300 of Douglas's men dead or wounded. Douglas himself narrowly escaped and rode hard back to the Scottish camp with the alarming report that a full English army was nearly upon them. His warning shattered any illusion of a leisurely campaign. David II immediately ordered his army to form for battle. Within moments, the quiet morning fields of Durham transformed into a theater of war, where the fate of Scotland and England's northern frontier would soon be decided. The Scottish camp erupted into motion the moment William Douglas returned with the grim news. Panic rippled at first through the ranks, but King David II quickly imposed order. Horns blared, captains shouted commands, and men rushed to arm themselves. The entire Scottish host, an army of 12,000 hardened soldiers, began forming into battle lines. David II led them eastward from Bear Park, choosing to take position on the higher ground less than half a mile west of Durham. At first, the elevated terrain seemed a tactical advantage, a place from which the Scots could descend upon the enemy. But as the morning mist thinned, the flaws in the landscape became painfully clear. The ground was broken and uneven, cut by dips and ridges that disrupted the tight formations upon which the Scottish fighting style depended. The army lacked significant numbers of archers, leaving them exposed to England's feared longbowmen. Even before the battle truly began, the Scots found themselves trapped in a position that offered more danger than strength. Nevertheless, David II arranged his men in the traditional Scottish manner. 3 massive divisions built around dense ranks of spearmen locked together in the formidable Schiltrin formation. These were not merely defensive circles, but deep, bristling blocks of men trained to hold steady against cavalry and crush anything that tried to force its way through. On the Scottish right stood the division of John Randolph, Earl of Moray, a veteran commander known for his bold, aggressive style. On the left, the Earl of March and Robert Stewart shared command, their division forming a mirror to Randolph's. David II himself positioned his division at the center, slightly behind the others. This was the reserve, the king's personal force, meant to deliver the decisive blow once the enemy lines faltered. It was a traditional and respected tactic. But on this uneven ground, the rigid Chilterns had difficulty keeping their cohesion. Still, the Scots braced themselves. The English would have to come to them, or so they believed. Across the field, the English army was forming up with far greater confidence. Their commanders understood the terrain intimately and arranged their 7,000 men in a formation designed specifically to counter the Scottish Chilterns. Almost the entire English force fought on foot, a deliberate choice to avoid the chaos cavalry could suffer when charging into dense spears. Only a small cavalry reserve remained mounted, positioned behind the main line for a decisive moment later. On the English left stood Lord Henry Percy, whose men formed a solid wall of infantry. On the right was Archbishop William Zouche of York, commanding not only soldiers but a formidable contingent of longbowmen. At the center, overseeing the whole array, Lord Ralph Neville held overall command. The English had no intention of rushing into the waiting spears of the Chilterns. They did not need to. Time was on their side. Outnumbered though they were, they held the advantage of mobility, discipline, and long-range firepower. So they adopted a defensive stance, letting the Scots stand in their awkward position on the broken hillside. For hours, the battlefield settled into a tense stalemate. Neither side moved, each waiting for the other to make the first mistake. The only sound was the distant murmur of soldiers, the clatter of armor, and the restless shifting of men lingering too long in anticipation of violence. By the afternoon, Neville recognized the opportunity to break the deadlock without risking a full advance. He ordered his longbowmen forward. Lines of English archers stepped out ahead of the main force, planting their feet firmly on the more level ground at the base of the slope. The Scottish lines watched uneasily, knowing they had few archers of their own to counter what was coming. When the English longbowmen raised their bows, the air seemed to tighten. Then the first volley soared skyward, darkening the late afternoon light before cascading down onto the Scottish formations. The longbows, with their superior range and penetrating power, immediately found their mark. Arrows thudded into Scottish shields, armor, and bodies, sowing turmoil within the tightly packed Chilterns. Frustrated and enraged, the Earl of Menteith led a small cavalry force in a desperate charge meant to scatter the English archers. But English arrows found them too. Horses collapsed mid-gallop, riders were thrown violently into the mud, and the survivors veered back in retreat before ever reaching the archers. The charge had failed utterly, accomplishing nothing except adding more confusion to the Scottish ranks. The unrelenting rain of arrows finally forced the Scots to move. The longbowmen had succeeded in provoking exactly what the English commanders wanted: the Scottish advance. Amid cries of anger and pain, the Scottish Chilterns began to push downhill, slowly at first, then with gathering determination. The ground shook beneath the weight of thousands of marching spearmen as they descended toward the English lines. But the advance was a nightmare. The broken ground disrupted their formations, causing gaps and uneven spacing. Meanwhile, the English longbowmen calmly continued their deadly work, sending volley after volley into the approaching masses. Arrows pierced through joints in armor, found openings in shields, or simply hammered into helmets with concussive force that staggered even the strongest warriors. Still, the Scots pressed on with grim resolve. They had no choice. To stand still was to die under a rain of arrows. Better to close the distance and bring the battle to grips. Yet as the Scots advanced, it became clear that their left division was suffering terribly. Under the sustained fire from the English archers, the division commanded by the Earl of March and Robert Stewart began to falter. The pressure was too great. the terrain too unforgiving, and the arrows too relentless. Finally, unable to maintain cohesion, the Scottish left broke. Panic surged through the ranks, and men began to flee the field. Most managed to escape, but in doing so they left the rest of the army exposed and drastically weakened at the very moment the battle was entering its most critical phase. The field of Neville's Cross was now on the brink of exploding into full chaos, and with the Scottish left in flight, the weight of the coming clash would fall entirely upon the remaining divisions. What followed would determine not only the outcome of the battle, but the fate of Scotland's king himself. The collapse of the Scottish left rippled across the battlefield, like a tear spreading through cloth. One moment, the Chiltern commanded by the Earl of March and Robert Stewart stood firm under the relentless storm of English arrows, and the next, it buckled, wavered, and finally dissolved into flight. Dust rose behind the retreating Scots as they abandoned their ground, leaving a gaping void along the flank of their own line. The battlefield, once a solid front of bristling Scottish spears, now sagged open like a wound. The men of the center and the right division watched this unraveling in disbelief, but they had no time to mourn the failure of their comrades. They were still marching forward, still bracing their spears against the steady, deadly rain of English arrows. The battle was entering its decisive moment. John Randolph, Earl of Moray, commanding the Scottish right, continued advancing despite the disaster unfolding to his left. He had always been a tenacious leader, a man unshaken even in the face of overwhelming odds. But even he could not fully compensate for the disintegration of an entire division. The English longbowmen, seeing the Scottish left crumble, shift their fire with ruthless precision. Arrows no longer merely sought to wound. They now hunted the weakened flank of the Scottish army, amplifying the chaos. Still, the Scottish center pressed forward, now taking the brunt of the English attack, their deep formations of spearmen pushing down the slope step by step, determined to close the distance and break the English line in close combat. Yet every foot they gained cost them dearly. Men fell as arrows hammered into their armor. Others stumbled over the bodies of their comrades. The uneven ground tore holes in the Chiltern, breaking the formation into smaller, poorly aligned blocks. What had once been a solid mass of spears had become clusters of desperate fighters struggling to maintain order under the storm of English fire. But the Scots had no choice but to continue. To stop was to die where they stood. Their only hope was to reach the English line before their formations disintegrated completely. The English, meanwhile, held their position with discipline and grim patience. Neville's center stood motionless behind their shields, waiting for the Scots to exhaust themselves before the inevitable clash. Henry Percy's left division was equally steady. On the right, Archbishop Zouche commanded the longbowmen, who continued to rain destruction on the advancing Scots. The English commanders understood that the Scots were weakening with every passing moment. They knew the broken terrain and relentless archery were doing more to crush the invaders than steel alone ever could. This was a battle of timing, of calculated pressure, and the English were content to let the Scots bleed until the perfect moment arrived. At last, the Scottish center reached the English line. The two armies crashed together with a roar of wood, metal, and human voices. Spears splintered, shields buckled, and men vanished beneath the tide of bodies pushing forward. The Scottish spearmen fought with raw fury, swinging the momentum of their entire march into the clash. For a moment, it seemed as if they might break through. The pressure was immense, a wave of hardened warriors throwing themselves against a disciplined English wall. It was the kind of brute force assault the Chiltern had been born to deliver. but the English line held firm. Behind their shields, English infantry absorbed the shock, bracing themselves as wave after wave of Scottish spearmen crashed upon them. The air filled with the sound of steel grating against steel, of spears snapping, and men shouting in rage and pain. The longbowmen, now too close to fire safely into the melee, ceased their volleys and instead drew short weapons, waiting for the moment the Scots broke formation. Despite their courage, the Scottish centre was beginning to waver. The absence of their left division had exposed them to attacks from the flank, where English soldiers began to edge inward, pressing against the side of the Chiltern. Randolph's right division fought relentlessly, but they too were now isolated, facing not only the English front, but the threat of encirclement. The battlefield had shifted decisively. What had begun as an orderly advance was devolving into a desperate struggle for survival. Even King David II, fighting at the heart of the center division, recognized the danger. Surrounded by his guards, he urged his men forward, but even his presence could not restore the cohesion of the battered Chiltern. The ranks were thinning, the formations warping under the pressure. The English infantry sensed the moment. They tightened their line, pushed forward, and began to grind the Scots backward. What had once been a solid, impenetrable block of spearmen was now an uneven, staggering mass. The once confident Scottish advance had stalled, and now, piece by piece, it was beginning to break. The breaking point was near, and the English, seeing the opportunity to end the battle, prepared to unleash the final blow that would shatter the Scots once and for all. The Scottish line, bruised and staggering under the relentless English pressure, had begun to unravel. It was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual and inevitable breaking. The kind that comes when exhaustion, fear, and relentless enemy assault combine into a force too heavy for even the bravest soldiers to withstand. The Chiltern formations, once the pride of Scotland's battlefield tradition, had lost their shape entirely. What remained were clusters of men locked in desperate combat, their spears shattered, their shields cracked, their discipline finally giving way under the crushing weight of English steel. Lord Ralph Neville watched the disarray from the English centre. He could see the Scottish lines bending and folding back, their formations thinning with every moment. The longbowmen had done their work. The infantry now pressed the advantage with grim resolve. But Neville understood that to end the battle decisively, one final push was necessary. The Scots were wavering, yet not fully broken. A decisive shock, delivered at the right moment, would collapse their resistance entirely. And so, he turned to the one force he had held in reserve from the beginning, the English cavalry. The reserve cavalry had waited all day for this command. Their horses stamped and bit at their bridles, eager after long hours of idling behind the lines. When Neville signaled them forward, they surged into motion like a sudden storm. Armor flashed, hooves thundered, and the ground trembled beneath their charge. They angled toward the fractured Scottish centre, where the King's division struggled to hold against the tightening English noose. The sight of the cavalry advancing sent a fresh wave of panic through the already weakened Scottish ranks. Those still trying to fight were suddenly overwhelmed by the realization that the English intended to crush them completely. King David II, surrounded by his household troops, attempted to rally what remained of the center division. His voice rose above the clamor of battle, urging his men not to yield, thrusting his sword toward the enemy as if daring the English to come for him. His guards fought savagely, holding off the encroaching infantry as long as they could. But the cavalry charge struck the Scots like a hammer. English horsemen slammed into the disordered Chiltern, exploiting every gap created by the terrain and earlier volleys of arrows. Spears shattered against shields and armor, Many Scots simply could not raise new defenses fast enough. The impact threw men to the ground and ripped apart what few coherent formations still survived. Once the cavalry carved through, the English infantry pressed in behind them. The Scots found themselves surrounded, attacked from multiple sides at once. The already dire situation now spiraled into total collapse. The Scottish Right Division, which had held longest under Randolph, finally broke under the combined assault of infantry and cavalry. Men threw down their weapons and tried to flee the field, but the English were relentless. Arrows continued to fall on any organized groups attempting retreat, and infantry pursued those scattering across the hillside. Everywhere, discipline gave way to survival instinct. The once proud Scottish host became a fleeing mass with no commander able to restore order. In the heart of the chaos, King David II fought on. He refused to abandon the field, hacking through enemies and suffering blow after blow. But even kings are not invincible. As he attempted to escape with a small escort, he was struck in the face by an arrow, the shaft lodging in his head. Wounded and disoriented, he continued to fight until he was finally overwhelmed and captured. The capture of the king shattered any last remnants of Scottish resistance. News of David's fall spread rapidly, turning retreat into a full rout. Scottish barons were cut down or taken prisoner in the thousands, their leadership gutted in a single afternoon. As daylight faded, English soldiers pursued the fleeing remnants of the Scottish army long into the night. Bodies littered the fields near Neville's cross. The stench of blood hung heavy in the air. The victorious English forces stood exhausted but triumphant, aware that they had won far more than a battlefield. They had seized a king, shattered an invading army, and secured the northern frontier in a single decisive blow. The Scottish dead numbered around 3,000, with more than 50 noble barons among the slain or captured. English losses, by contrast, were only a few hundred. The magnitude of the victory was undeniable, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Scotland had not merely lost a battle. It had lost its monarch, its military leadership, and its momentum in the war. The kingdom now stood leaderless and vulnerable, forced onto the defensive as English influence crept deeper into its politics during David's long captivity. The Battle of Neville's Cross had reshaped the balance of power across Britain, carving its place into history through fire, iron, and the fall of a king.